Good evening, Gloucester Severn, for the second time. This evening, I'm talking about unidentified flying objects, with the subtitle there, thinking about whether or not there are any images that need an extraterrestrial explanation, or perhaps do all of the explanations sit a little closer to Earth. To start with, let's just remind ourselves about statistics. If we ask a group of, perhaps not a random group of individuals, this was American students being asked, have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth? The response was a staggering 40% yes. This was from Chapman University. It was a few years ago. I really ought to update these stats, and I'd love to know whether or not this is the same in the UK or anywhere close in the UK. But young Americans seem to think, yes, 40% seem to say we have been visited. What about the question, are they visiting us now? You might think that would be a lot lower. Well, a bit lower, 35%. The worrying thing is not only is that a large number, it's less than the number who believe in ghosts in the same survey, but it's rather larger than the number who believe in telekinesis or Bigfoot, or most worryingly, it's actually larger than the number of people who believe in evolution. That says something perhaps more about either students or American students. But as I say, I'd love to know what the stats are for the average UK population. A little while ago, this cartoon appeared saying, if you think of the percentage of the US, or you could argue that pretty much the same throughout other countries in the world, the percentage of people who carry cameras with them every waking moment of their lives, in other words, essentially none until the advent of the mobile phone with a built-in camera, but that's now almost 100%. So you could argue, given that everybody has now got a camera, doesn't that conclusively settle the argument of flying saucers, UFOs, lake monsters, ghosts, or Bigfoot? Because if they really did exist, we would be overwhelmed with evidence, which we aren't. Well, basically, no, it's not settled. Because if you Google UFO, you get a staggering 250 million pages that talk about UFOs. Some of them might be debunking UFOs. A lot of them will be saying they exist. So it implies that despite so many cameras in existence, the whole argument of the existence of UFOs is quite definitely not settled. So this evening, I'm going to subdivide UFOs into a number of categories. I believe that basically all UFO images, and remember, I'm talking about images, I'm not talking about accounts of people seeing UFOs, I'm not talking about alien abductions, I'm talking about images that exist and can be analysed. I think they can be categorised as man-made objects, or natural objects, or image artefacts. In other words, they only exist in the camera, not actually in the outside world. There's obviously a possibility of fakery, and the elephant in the room is there's actually one fifth category, and that is, of course, they could be extraterrestrial spacecraft with extraterrestrials visiting Earth. So I'm going to look at each of those categories. First, let's get a few definitions sorted out. I conform to the conventional usage of the acronym UFO to mean something observed in the night sky that is not readily identified. And regarding an extraterrestrial origin, I certainly side with Carl Sagan, who said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In other words, if you want to convince anybody that you have seen a UFO, you really need concrete evidence rather than simply saying, well, I don't know what it was. Another useful tool for the rational scientist is Occam's razor, which states something like, if there are two explanations for an observation, then the one that requires the least speculation is usually the better of the two. And that's often reduced to the somewhat snappier statement, simpler solutions are more likely to be correct than complex ones. So let's bear that in mind when we look at the possibilities of explanations for some of the images we're going to be looking at. Where do we get reliable information about UFOs from? Well, one source of reliable information is, of course, from America, where there were lots of these things dotted around. Notice the friendly alien on the front porch there, willing to give anybody passing by some useful information. But unfortunately, most of the images are not very good. We would love it if the ideal UFO image looked like this, if it was clear, if it was detailed, if it was in focus, if the camera hadn't moved, if there was no camera shake, and if it was well exposed. But unfortunately, we never get nice, clear UFO images. At best, we get something that looks like that. It's blurred. It's out of focus. The camera has probably moved, and it's often overexposed if it was taken at night. Taking an image like that and blowing it up makes no difference whatsoever. We just do not know what that is. It's not helped by the fact that if we look at old images meaning images in the pre-digital era, these days we take a picture and it's time-stamped, and probably if it's taken on our phone, we have GPS coordinates as well. So we know precisely where it was taken, we know precisely when it was taken, which date, which time to the nearest second, and we've got a lot of information about the type of camera that was used, the exposure, the F number, etc. But if we go back to film cameras, well, quite often we just do not have the information. We do not know which camera took it, which lens, what exposure, what aperture, where in the world was it taken, which way was the photographer pointing when the picture was taken. Is it horizontal? Is it up in the sky? With a picture like this, we have no idea whatsoever. And without that so-called metadata, without that data surrounding the image itself, then we really have no chance of analysing the image to tell what it is that's being photographed. That's a bit of a shame, but that's just the way it is. Most images can simply be thrown away because we cannot tell what they are. I did wonder where the first UFO images ever appeared, and I saw this set of hieroglyphs. When I first saw them, I assumed that, somebody has simply played around with Photoshop. These things don't actually exist, because we've got an Apache helicopter in the top left, and we have Luke Skywalker's land speeder next to that, and we have, what's that, a Zeppelin below it. So I assumed it had simply been manipulated, but apparently not. This is a genuine set of hieroglyphs. But the explanation is just as down to earth as assuming that there are fanciful flying aircraft that's been chiselled into these rocks. And the answer is simply that we're looking at two sets of hieroglyphs. Two pharaohs competed to get their hieroglyphs on this particular piece of rock, in much the same way that you might conceivably reuse a piece of paper, erase the previous pencil, and then write your own stuff on the top. And these two pharaohs chiselled away their hieroglyphs, and one did not erase the other. So if we were to go to the original image and colour code it according to which pharaoh we're talking about, then the Apache helicopter disappears, the land speeder disappears, the Zeppelin disappears. Bit of a shame, but a much more down-to-earth explanation for some rather odd-looking symbols there. So let's go through the various categories. UFOs might be man-made objects. The US Air Force has tried to make this easy for us by giving us an identification chart. So some of these silhouettes in the sky, well, we might conceivably think that maybe these are rather top-secret spy planes that are flying around over America. But no, the US Air Force has made it quite clear that what we're looking at is a weather balloon, a weather balloon, a weather balloon, a weather balloon, a weather balloon. Next one, swamp gas, weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon. So the US Air Force is trying to make life easy for us, but I think we can be a little sceptical with their identification of some of these objects. What about this one? What do you think this is that we're looking at? There's a little bit of stuff in the foreground. There looks to be a silhouette of a tree on the left-hand side, and I think that's a leaf of a branch that's coming in. But what do you think these objects are? I'll give you a few seconds just to think what it is that we're looking at here. Are we looking at the long exposure photo of a fleet of UFOs flying in formation? What sort of aircraft fly in formation like this? Commercial airliners don't fly in formation. Military aircraft might fly in formation, but generally speaking, not that far apart, and they don't do it with their lights on at night. So what do we think this is? Well, actually, it's not a long exposure of anything. It's a snapshot. Whereas if you think of it as a long exposure, you get the wrong impression that we're dealing with 5 or 6 objects that are flying through the sky on parallel paths. In fact, what we're looking at is taken from Pylon of the Month, December 2019. Yes, there is such a thing as the Pylon of the Month. And the pylon, yes, we're talking about mains electricity pylons. If I add to the image on the left a picture of a pylon, then perhaps you can see what it is we're looking at. It's a misty night, so the pylon itself isn't visible, but the cables that run from one pylon to another, in this particular case, are covered in ice, and they are simply reflecting the light that is presumably just over the horizon there. So, again, a perfectly natural explanation, but if you think of it as a long exposure, your brain reinterprets what it is you're looking at. And for those that are curious, there is the web address of Pylon of the Month. If you haven't got enough electricity pylons and want to go and have a look at lots of photos of them, go to that webpage. And when we do look in the sky, well, there's been plenty of rocket launches that have produced some really weird and wonderful things in the sky. I mean, who could not look at that, especially if you didn't know there had been a rocket launch? Who could look at that and think, wow, it looks like we're being invaded? The plumes that come up from a rocket exhaust, especially around sunset when the rocket is high in the sky and catching the sun's last rays, can produce some spectacular structures. But they're all understandable in terms of the exhaust plume that comes from rockets launched presumably minutes, possibly hours, but generally minutes earlier than the photographs were taken. This is a rather nice one where the rocket, long since gone from the photograph, the rocket might have taken a relatively vertical track, but it left a contrail behind it, and the movement of air layers in the atmosphere has contorted the original rocket trail into this very complex structure and produced this wonderful iridescence. Because of the chemicals that are left in the contrail of the rocket exhaust, it can produce these wonderfully iridescent colours when they just catch the last rays of the sun. Again, if you see this in the sky and didn't know what had been happening, you may be thinking that something extraterrestrial is going on. Are we being invaded? Are these ships coming into our atmosphere? This was Astronomy Picture of the Day 2019, 8th of April, as indicated in the bottom right-hand corner there. What's actually going on is that scientists have sent up some sounding rockets and released various fluorescent chemicals that are glowing in different colours at different heights. And what the scientists are trying to do here is to take these fluorescent gases, release them at 100 kilometres or 150 kilometres or 200 kilometres into the atmosphere to try and get an idea of what's actually going on at these extreme heights. Because that's the height at which aurora occur, and it was effectively an aurora experiment that was going on here. And by releasing gases into the atmosphere and watching what happens to these gas plumes over time, we get an idea of how the atmosphere is moving, and how the gas is dispersing gives us an idea of how aurora occur. The idea of lots of dots in the sky, well, maybe 10 or 20 years ago this would have been really weird to see a lot of dots apparently in formation. But of course this has become a lot more common these days, and the idea of drones that actually have lights on them, well, that's getting very close to being commonplace now. For instance, the King Charles coronation, where we had some spectacular precision drone control. So the idea of a few lights in the sky dancing around is no longer a surprise to us, and probably won't be thought of as UFOs by people that have seen many of these displays. Some people claim that when they look down from an aircraft, well, they don't see UFOs themselves, but they see what are clearly UFO landing sites. Here we see 3 of them in the desert somewhere over America. It doesn't take too much to realise that if you see one of these, or see a few of these as you're flying along, all you need to do is make a note of the time, and then simply by looking at a map you can figure out where were you overflying at that particular time in your journey, and a little bit of Google Earth or a little bit of research will very quickly tell you what it is that you're actually looking at. So it does look a little bit odd to see these what appear to be reflections of some very odd structures, but as soon as you get a clear picture of what's down there, it's fairly obvious what's going on. It's actually a solar plant where lots of mirrors are reflecting sunlight to the central region where you get very high temperatures, either to generate power or simply to generate heat to melt objects for metallurgy. So on a large scale, you can see, depending on the angle that the mirrors make relative to you and relative to the sun, you can get some odd reflections. And from a height, from a few miles high, it can appear a little bit odd, but as soon as you get close, it's fairly clear what these objects actually are. Let's have a look at a couple of videos. I'm not intending to spend too long looking at videos rather than still images, as I was more interested in still images and I did not have time to look at the 500,000 different YouTube videos that all purport to show UFOs. But this one I thought was interesting. It was posted on social media and I've taken the audio out because the camera person is getting very excited saying, "Look, there's a huge cigar-shaped UFO hovering over the lake. This is incredible. It's been there for quite a few minutes, etc." It was posted on social media and social media had a few million hits, I think. And it persisted, not just for a few hours, it persisted for days and weeks and months, even though within hours it was clear what the solution, what the explanation actually was. Almost immediately it was posted by Goodyear, "Sorry guys, that's us. Quite definitely that's our blimp over a stadium on the other side of the lake." But even though the explanation was out there, it didn't stop loads and loads of people looking at the video saying, "That's incredible, there's a huge UFO hovering over the lake." That's a sad reflection of how social media works. The sensational headline gets in there and lots of people bundle in on any piece of news, but the explanation is almost always forgotten, even if the explanation comes hot on the heels of the original posting. I saw a reference to, "Hey guys, look, we've got here some super clear footage." I thought, well, that's interesting because most of the footage I see on YouTube of UFOs is very blurred and very difficult to follow. So the idea of somebody saying there's a super clear footage, I thought, well, maybe that's worth a look. So for the next few seconds, let's have a look at this super clear footage of a UFO. And that's pretty typical. I'm not sure if that was enough for you to get any sort of a sense of what it is that they were actually trying to video. After a few minutes, which I'm not going to show you, they eventually managed to steady the camera. Perhaps the photographer started to lean against a wall or maybe steady himself or herself somewhat to try and get better footage. And eventually it is clear what the UFO is. And a few seconds later, we're treated to the view of, yeah, okay, it's now obvious what it is. It's not a UFO, it's quite definitely identified. Some youngster, possibly a Jennifer, possibly a Jonathan, had a birthday party and their mylar balloon got out of control and floated up into the air. And it happens to be catching the sun, giving some rather interesting colours, but nothing particularly strange, just a reflective balloon. And I'm not sure how many UFO footage videos actually are these sorts of balloons, but probably a very, very large fraction. One piqued my interest because I wasn't intending to start looking at video after video because basically life is too short. But there was one that I noticed in passing, and it said, "This particular one is the gold standard." They said Puerto Rico's close proximity to the Bermuda Triangle may explain why it's a hotbed of UFOs. And they said there have been countless UFO sightings over the years, but many experts, I don't know who these experts are, but apparently many experts consider this next piece of footage the gold standard in UFO videos. So I thought, I am not going to watch thousands of UFO videos. But if this one is considered the gold standard, if this one is considered to be the most convincing UFO video, then it at least deserves me watching it before dismissing it. So I thought, okay, this is worth looking at. So what is this gold standard video UFO? It was taken by the US Customs and Border Control with an infrared camera. Now, I figured that if the US are patrolling their border, and it's a customs border patrol, and they're looking for immigrants and contraband coming across the border, they probably have some pretty high-spec gear. They're in an aircraft, and I would imagine they've got possibly a state-of-the-art infrared camera. This is not an iPhone on the end of a selfie stick. This is going to be $100,000 worth of quality camera. So I thought maybe it's worth watching. I also realized that the video was quite a few minutes long, and some of the videos that are online are so short you can't actually tell what it is you're looking at. But this one is substantially longer. So it's a source that I think is possibly reliable if it's genuinely coming from the US Customs. And there's a lot of information that you can see presented on the screen there. But let's watch the video first. There's the UFO. It's infrared, so dark means it's warm in this case. White means cool, dark means warm. So there's a relatively warm object, and we're going to follow it for a minute or two. So there's the object that appears to be flying along at breakneck speed. We'll come to the speed in just a moment. But at the moment, this object seems to be flying along. There's some cows in the background. There's some fields in the background. It's flying along. It's difficult to see exactly how large it is. It's just a blob, apparently. But this object, I don't know if that was a golf course. There seemed to be a lake there in the background. The object is then going to fly over a few more trees and I think over a little bit of an industrial estate. And then this object is continuing to be tracked by customs who aren't sure what it is. Seems to overfly the taxiway of the airport. And then the object seems to overfly the runway itself of the airport. And continues to move, as it happens, further north. And the camera follows this object for quite a while. It's overflying another industrial estate. It then flies over a road and continues out towards the north coast of the country in question. In this case, it happens to be Puerto Rico. But there's a couple of things that are interesting in this video. One of the most useful bits of information that I could find here, apart from the fact it gives the date and the time, is it gives the precise GPS location of the aircraft. ACFT is the aircraft. So frame by frame by frame of this video, we know exactly where the aircraft is. But just as useful is the fact that on the right-hand side, we have the target. What that means is the aircraft has got a camera on board. The aircraft knows precisely where it is, and it knows which way the camera is pointing. And it knows the height of the aircraft, which means it knows precisely the GPS coordinates of the point that the camera is looking at. In other words, the ground immediately behind the UFO, strictly not the UFO, but the point behind this white cross, which most of the time is the UFO, the GPS location of the point that the camera is looking at is again known precisely. Every frame of the video, we know where the camera is and we know where the camera is pointing. If we look at a few stills, there's the UFO. What's in the background? I think these are probably cows. These are animals in a field, and I think they're cows, which means this object is probably a bit smaller than a cow. It might be a similar temperature. It's a bit difficult to tell, but the object is warm, and of course the cows are warm in the background as well. There are some cars on the road. There's the UFO just going off to the left. The cars on the road, the bonnet just sitting above the engine is warmer than the rest of the car, and so the bonnet of the cars are showing up as dark as well. So this object is small-ish, warm at about the same temperature as the bonnet of a car. So let's see where it is. This is the northern edge of Puerto Rico. It's close to the airport, as you can see, the Rafael Hernandez Airport. There's the scale, 1 kilometre, and I'm just going to dim down because I'm not interested really in the landscape per se. We can plot the position of the UFO for every frame in the video, because remember, in the bottom right hand corner was the target. So this is either the UFO or the land immediately behind the UFO as seen from the aircraft. And a lot of people say, well, this UFO is heading in the direction of the arrow, and bear in mind that on the day in question there was a breeze coming from the northeast towards the southwest, so the UFO was actually heading into the wind. And they say this object is moving at hundreds of miles an hour and it is heading into the wind, it's not heading downwind. And no known object without propulsion can possibly do this. Interesting. Bear in mind, I haven't taken every frame of the video, I've taken every 10th frame or something to avoid getting too many dots on my little track of the UFO ground track. But remember, every frame of the video not only tells me where the UFO appeared to be, but also I've got the position of the aircraft. And there's the position of the aircraft for the first minute or so, the first couple of minutes of this video. You notice the aircraft is travelling relatively uniformly. It doesn't look like it's quite so uniform for the motion of the UFO. But remember Occam's razor. We could say the UFO is going at hundreds of miles an hour in the direction indicated into the wind. But let's think if there's a simpler explanation. Let's take, for instance, a position of the aircraft and the equivalent position at the same frame of the UFO. So the aircraft was there and the UFO appeared to be sitting over this piece of ground, but of course it might have been somewhere else on this grey line. The blue dot is simply the point behind the UFO as seen from the aircraft. Let's do the same a few seconds later. Let's take the aircraft position and where the UFO appears to be. And let's do it again. And let's do it again. And let's do it again. What do you notice? Yes, perhaps the object is actually moving along the blue line. But isn't it much more likely that the object is actually static where the black dot is? And the only reason it appears to be going hell for leather in the northeast direction is because the aircraft is flying hell for leather in the southwest direction. And if you take an image of a static object, of course it will appear to move against the backdrop of whatever, the fields, the runway, the houses, the roads. So that seems to me a lot more sensible. Not only that, but I took a few more readings. The actual plane flies further south. It's amazing actually that even though the plane is quite a few miles away, it can still see that object quite clearly. Even though it's miles away, this infrared camera is indeed quite a good performance infrared camera. When I continued that track downwards, I found that the black dot isn't absolutely static. Most of the time it seems to be where that black dot is. But if you wait a few minutes longer, the black dot appears to move ever so slightly towards the west-southwest. Remember which way the wind is blowing? From the northeast. So the fact that this object is slowly moving in the direction of the black arrow is no surprise whatsoever when you remember there's a slight breeze blowing in that direction. So we apply Occam's razor. YouTube says, of countless UFO sightings, many experts, unspecified who these experts are, but apparently many UFO experts consider this video as the gold standard. The description says that what we're looking at is a metallic orb moving at incredible speed with no obvious propulsion into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. And then they finish with, the infrared camera sees an object that does not match anything we know of. In other words, there is no technology that can explain this video. Okay. Well, there is no evidence at all that it's a metallic orb. It is something that appears to be slightly warmer than its surroundings. No, it's not moving at incredible speed. for the reasons we've just looked at. No obvious propulsion? Well, I don't see any engines there, so that's fair enough. There are no obvious ways that it can move into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. But I don't think it is moving into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. And as for the infrared camera sees an object that does not match anything we know of, well, who are these experts that they got to look at this video? I would argue that a much simpler explanation is that the object we're looking at is essentially static. It only appears to be moving because the aircraft is moving. It is drifting, perhaps slowly, downwind. It's pretty obvious to me it's a balloon. What type of balloon, I don't know. If it was a mylar balloon, it would have warmed up during the day and then radiated its heat during the evening. Perhaps that's what it was. When we revisit this no obvious propulsion, well, if we think it was drifting downwind, well, there is obvious propulsion. It was drifting downwind. So none of the comments made on this particular video are valid. And I think an awful lot of videos that show objects that appear to be moving, it doesn't matter whether they were imaged by the US Customs and Border Patrol, it doesn't matter whether they were imaged by a US Navy pilot, that's irrelevant. If you see an object that seems to be moving at great speed, but the image was taken from an aircraft moving at great speed, you have to be very careful that you are actually seeing what you think you're seeing. Hence the advantage of actually having the GPS coordinates of the aircraft and the target and be able to just draw a few straight lines and show, no, it looks like the object wasn't moving at all. I have a feeling that all the videos that purport to show objects moving at high speed are in this category, that it's the camera movement that makes you think it's moving at high speed. Let's go on to the next category. UFOs might be not man-made objects, but natural objects. And here we say, well, Cloud Appreciation Society, again, we've dealt with Pylon of the Month previously. Now we can look at Cloud of the Month. The Cloud Appreciation Society does indeed have a Cloud of the Month. And some of these clouds look a bit weird. Some of them could be, conceivably, that one, for instance, makes me think of the opening credits of Independence Day or something like that. Some of these clouds look a bit odd. That one in the bottom right, September's Cloud of the Month, that's a full street cloud. It sort of looks like a large circular object has come plummeting through a cloud layer and punched a hole in it. But there are good meteorological reasons why clouds form this way. So just because clouds look odd doesn't mean we should immediately label them as UFOs. We simply need to learn a little bit more about meteorology. Some lenticular clouds can look absolutely spectacular, and indeed a cloud like this, you might be forgiven to think that looks rather artificial, even though it's a perfectly natural phenomena. But just because it's a natural phenomena doesn't stop people taking a beautiful image like this and then putting it into Photoshop and augmenting it, shall we say, with a little bit of extra artistic license. What was wrong with the original image, I ask you? Lots of natural phenomena produce rather interesting effects. This looks like we've got a whole load of floodlights pointing directly up into the sky, which looks really weird. In fact, what's just behind these houses are just normal streetlights. But what we have here, obviously in a rather cold environment, this is taken from Finland, whenever you have a lot of ice in the atmosphere, the ice can form little hexagonal platelets which act like small horizontal mirrors. The platelets tend to sit horizontally because that's just a stable position for them to be in the atmosphere. So if these hexagonal ice crystals, these platelets, form in the atmosphere, they can behave like a whole set of mirrors. And these mirrors will produce reflections of lights that you perhaps can't see over your horizon, and you get this impression of a lot of columns of light starting at street lights beyond your vision. This can happen in various countries. Again, in Scandinavia, this gives an interesting effect. The colour is purely effect of the street lights themselves having different colours. I'm not quite sure why they appear so blue, but the different colours are nothing to do with the pillars themselves. If I understand correctly, they are just different colours of lights. Again, lights that you can't see too well just over the horizon, and the ice crystals give you these reflections. I've not seen them myself, but they do look quite amazing. I think the best shot is actually this one, where the ice crystals are high in the atmosphere and you get the light pillars reflecting lights from a long way away. You can see the lights quite clearly on the horizon, but if you were to see this, it's very easy to sort of divorce the idea of these lights in the sky being related to the lights on the horizon. So you get this city in the sky, or possibly spaceship in the sky sort of effect. Not seen it myself, but it must be quite spectacular when you manage to catch it. In some cases, these are pictures taken from Wisconsin. You get the light pillars indicating that the ice crystals are horizontal, but then these light pillars seem to branch out, indicating that the crystals are starting to vary in their position. Instead of being horizontal, perhaps there's a change in temperature, and the ice crystals are now at a range of different angles, which means the light pillar branches out into these rather odd looking funnel structures. Again, if you didn't know what you were looking at, perhaps you might think something very unusual is going on there. These are red sprites. Until recently, we didn't really have any decent photos at all of red sprites. It is thought that these are phenomena that occur above thunderclouds. We're used to the idea that a thundercloud can have lightning discharges from the cloud to the ground. We're all used to that idea. But it wasn't appreciated until relatively recently that we can get some rather interesting atmospheric activity above thunderclouds. It's not really lightning as such, but it arguably is in the same category. And the red sprites are rather fainter than this photograph would indicate, and they don't usually last long, so they're rather difficult to catch. But again, if you ever saw them, if you ever photographed them, you would be forgiven to thinking something very odd is occurring in the skies above you. This particular picture was taken in 2017 and was probably the best we could do back then. It's interesting to note that technology has advanced somewhat, and a picture taken a few months ago at the end of 2023 shows the same red sprites, but now in much more detail, and it is really amazing what sort of structures exist. You can see it was a clear sky, but apparently these sprites that occur over some sort of a thundercloud, a thunder system, produce these really weird structures that look a little bit like forked lightning, and yet they end with these very peculiar, rather ghostly cones of light, which appear to be on the end of most of these forks. But understanding exactly what's going on, this is still an active area of research. I think 20 years ago, anybody that claimed these existed would have been laughed out of existence. But now we have a number of different photographs of these objects, but we're still trying to understand exactly why they occur. Perhaps you can figure out what this particular observation is. It was reported as an arc-shaped UFO over Ontario. The person submitting the photograph, which I'll show you in a moment, said, "Nearing the end of the day, I sat down on my deck facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white. In truth, I cannot be sure what it truly is. My conclusion is a UFO." And that, of course, is fairly common. If people don't know what they're looking at, the knee-jerk reaction is it's a UFO, rather than it's something which I haven't looked up yet, or it's something that somebody else can explain. It must be a UFO because I don't know what it is. My friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. If you can't tell what it is you're looking at, how can you actually tell its size? You can only tell something's size if you know how far away it is. And when you've got a light in the sky, it is almost impossible to tell how far that light is. Is it a relatively dim light quite close to you, or is it a very bright light a substantial distance away from you? If you can't judge distance, then you really can't judge size. So my friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. I thought 1 airliner, but maybe he's right. Okay, some difference of opinion there. But for anybody that's ever looked out into the west after sunset on a clear sky and saw something brilliant white, will know what it is that this person saw. The subject of so many UFO sightings, this is simply Venus. Venus is visible in the evening sky for a lot of the year. It's very bright, and day after day after day, whenever Venus appears in the sky, lots of people report it as a UFO, possibly because they're just not used to seeing it quite so bright, even though it's basically there every evening for many months, and the same as a morning object, again, for many months of the year. Venus shows phases like the moon. It's not as large as the moon in the sky, so you need either binoculars or you need a zoom lens on a camera. In this case, the zoom lens on the camera zoomed in on the extreme here, and then we see that Venus is actually exhibiting a crescent phase, hence the arc-shaped UFO. But again, many people have looked at Venus with binoculars and seen a crescent Venus, so that is not at all unusual. Let's look at the next category. We thought about man-made objects, we thought about natural objects. UFOs might be image artifacts. If anybody says, I've taken a picture which seems to show a UFO, I don't remember seeing it at the time, but it's come out in my images or my photographs, you can bet your bottom dollar that they're looking at an image artifact. If they didn't see it with their own eyes, but it's in the photo, chances are it's an artifact. So when it was reported in 1952, mysterious lights were sighted over Washington, D.C., as indicated here behind the Capitol building. Well, no, they weren't seen. They were photographed over Washington, D.C. So somebody took a picture and they saw this, what appears to be set of UFOs. They all seem to be sort of butterfly shaped, all little double structure there, all little dumbbells flying along in formation. Nobody saw them, but they're on the photo. Okay, what's the explanation? Well, what's the simplest explanation for having a lot of objects like that? Lenses are never perfect. If you have lights shining into a camera lens, you will almost certainly get reflections. Now, modern lenses are very good at eliminating or at least reducing reflections. But if you go back, in this case, more than half a century, you will find that every lens produces reflections. And what have we got at the bottom of the picture? We've got a whole load of lights shining into the camera lens. Let's take those lights at the very bottom of the image. Let's take them, make them upside down, because reflections are upside down, and think about what they would look like if they were up at the top. 1 point, 2 close together, 2 slightly further apart, 2 that we can't see because they're sort of sitting on the top of the dome there, 1 on the right-hand side. Every little butterfly or dumbbell there corresponds to one of the lights that's in the foreground, and a reflection, which makes it upside down, explains the lights shining into the lens produce reflections which then appear as if they are sitting behind the building. A much simpler explanation than having a fleet of UFOs flying over the city. What about this one with a text tag that said something like, "This large craft came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen in the image." I'm not sure what the windows are. Maybe the windows are these things here. But it was reported that this is a UFO sighting that is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. You can tell they're serious because aliens is in capital letters. That's how serious they are. And if you look at this, you could say, what on earth is it we're looking at? Well, if you look at that, you can't tell. But if you look at the whole image before it was cropped, you realise that what's in the middle of the image? A very, very bright object, probably the full moon, I would guess. So the full moon is shining right into the camera lens, producing a horrible reflection. I would guess that this particular lens, again, we don't have the data, we don't know which camera, we don't know which lens, but I'm guessing that this particular lens was a poor quality lens and the reflections produced are pretty horrible, and it produces that very distorted shape on the top left-hand side. Nothing to do with a spacecraft with windows and a pilot waving at us. A more up-to-date version of sort of the same thing. Somebody posted this on social media saying, what's that odd thing in the top left with the, it seems to have an aura around it. What is this in the sky? I don't remember seeing it at the time, but it came out on my photos. Again, that rings alarm bells. If they didn't see it, but they caught it on camera, then is it a UFO? Well, they, to their credit, basically hashtag UFO, but they are at least asking a serious question. Hashtag serious question. They do want to know what the answer is. And in this particular case, if we have a look at that object and blow it up a bit so we can see what it is, well, perhaps we can't see what it is. But think about the image. There's the image. There's a really, really bright object shining into the camera. The sun is peeking out from behind this wall. So the sun should be a disk. Should be a disk about half a degree or so in diameter. But some of the sun is being blocked by this wall. If it did produce a reflection, take that, turn it upside down, what do we get? We get a disk with part of the disk shadowed by the fact that the wall is stopping the light coming from the right-hand side of the image or the left-hand side of the reflection. What's all this other stuff that seems to be eating into the disk of the sun? Well, the sun is shining through the filigree work of the lamp holder here. We can't really see it because the sun is so bright, but there's a filigree work to the lamp holder, and that is what we're seeing here. This is, as far as I can tell, a perfect reflection of what you would expect to see with the light shining partly around the wall and partly through the lamp holder. So again, a perfectly reasonable explanation. Always be careful when you've got very bright lights in the image. You will always get reflections to some extent or another. This one I quite enjoyed. A huge slab photographed in the sky. What appears to be a flat, rectangular aircraft with lights all the way around the edge, hovering in the air. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it's an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Notice how much authority you give to a UFO if you start attaching letters and numbers to it. Rather than simply say this is an unexplained object in the sky, if you say this is probably a TR-3B, somebody might take you seriously. So what do we think that is? Well, have a look at the clues in the image. Look at what's going on in the foreground. It looks to me like this is a very rainy night. There's some cars and headlights in the distance, and I think these are a whole load of raindrops on a windscreen. So I think this is being taken through the windscreen of a car or a van on a rainy day. So is that object a large rectangular aircraft slab hanging in the sky, or is it a reflection in the windscreen of a phone that's sitting on the dashboard? Stick an iPhone on the dashboard, it'll probably have some reflections around the edges, and you will almost certainly get an image that looks like that. So is it a large rectangular slab in the sky, or is it a reflection of a mobile phone sitting on the dashboard? Occam's razor says that one is a much simpler explanation than the other. Fourth category, we've had man-made objects, natural objects, we've had image artifacts. The fourth category is UFOs might not be real at all because the images or videos you see online, heaven forbid, might actually be faked. Now, any image in which somebody has to point at the object to convince you what it is you're looking at, that's obviously a little bit of a joke, fine. You see a lot of images like this. Well, okay, it's a very nice image. I don't know if this was done in Photoshop or some other graphic software. But I think it's fair to say that if an object like that appeared over an interstate in America or any crowded area, I think we would find that a few thousand, if not a few tens of thousands of people might have noticed. And then you will get a lot of people photographing the same object. Not a single person photographing it, but thousands of people all photographing the same object, if it's actually a real object. So I think we can safely say that, as this is the only picture of this particular UFO, this again is a fake picture of a UFO. If we go back to old film, we can get some interesting insight into looking at a few old images. This particular one from 1966, where we seem to have 3 UFOs flying through the air. But if we do a little bit of just zooming in, we don't have to do an awful lot of image processing. We can just look in more detail at the UFO and some foreground detail, or at least middle distance detail. I think these might be tram lines, I'm not too sure, but it doesn't really matter. If we look at the detail, we find a somewhat fuzzy looking UFO and a relatively sharp set of tram lines. The tram lines are not much more than a pixel of this digitized image, which clearly was taken on film back in 1966, not a digital camera. So given that the tram lines, or whatever they are, appear to be quite sharp, and the houses in the distance, the chimneys, appear to be quite sharp, why is the UFO blurred? Well, if it was blurred because of movement, it would be blurred in one direction, but still sharp in the other. No, this is a UFO in the sense of a fake unidentified flying object that's simply been cut and pasted onto an old picture and deliberately blurred so that you don't see any detail in the flying saucer. It's simply incongruous in terms of it does not fit the rest of the picture. If it was genuinely there, it would be basically as sharp as the other objects that we can see, the chimneys in the distance or the tram lines in the tram cables in the near foreground. And we can apply the same logic, if you like, to this particular still from a video. Shocking new footage of an alien ship over Chicago. This was apparently the best UFO sighting from May 2015. Again, if this is the best you can do, then they're really struggling. I took the image and it was relatively easy to process the image to bring out some of the details so I could see what was actually going on. And once I did that, I found that yes, the sky looks rather mottled. That's perfectly normal whenever you have some noise in the background of a relatively uniform grey or whatever it was supposed to be. It's perfectly natural to get some mottling like this from noise in the image. But look at this triangular UFO. Look how sharp its edges are. They are razor sharp. If this is the sort of mottling you get in the background due to variations in intensity and the finite resolution of the camera that took the images, you wouldn't expect the edges of the UFO to be as sharp as they are. This has quite definitely been cut and pasted from somewhere else and plonked on top of basically just video of the sky. A couple of UFOs that are purportedly buzzing Air Force One. Air Force One is quite a considerable distance away, which is why it's a little bit fuzzy. And also you notice that the darkest parts of the aircraft, where there's virtually no light from the sun, there's not black, but the engines and the underside of the aircraft are just a little bit blue, because there's probably a few miles of air, a few miles of atmosphere between us and Air Force One, and the atmosphere scatters light. Water vapour and air molecules will scatter light, which is why the sky is blue. So distant objects tend to be low contrast and quite often a little bluish tinge to them as well. But the UFOs appear to be a neutral grey and quite contrasty compared to Air Force One, even though they're supposed to be at the same distance. So again, the contrast of those objects doesn't seem to match the contrast of the object which is supposed to be at the same distance. So those are fake. This I was curious about. So this is the deck of an aircraft carrier where we have an F-18 jet, a helicopter, and what appears to be a triangular UFO just sitting there. Again, because I like playing around with images, I wondered, is it possible to prove that this is a fake? It certainly looks like a fake to me, but is it possible to prove it? I looked at the intensities of various pixels, the actual grey of the flight deck of this carrier. I thought, let's look at something genuine. As far as I know, the F-18 jet is genuine. So I looked at the pixels that are right next to the F-18. And I plotted the intensity of the pixels on the vertical axis as a function of where those pixels are. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. The numbers simply refer to how grey or how dark grey or how light grey are these pixels that run along the line of the runway of the carrier deck. And you would expect to get some variations. You wouldn't expect them all to be the same brightness, all the same shade of grey. There will always be some variation, just like you see here. Notice that the brightness is 70, sometimes it's a little bit less than 70, sometimes it's a little bit more than 70. So they're all similar shades of grey, but there is always some variation. That's perfectly natural. What happens if you look at the shades of grey over towards the UFO itself? You get something that looks rather different. Next to the triangular UFO, you find if you do the same thing and plot intensity as a function of position, you get normal looking background, and then you get BAM, identical, 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 then you get normal variation. In other words, the pixels right next to the actual UFO itself are all identical shades of grey. Not similar, but identical. This indicates that the image has been manipulated. So I guess the triangular UFO has been cut and pasted from somewhere else, and then somebody has tidied up the pixels by perhaps smoothing them out in this region. As a second observation, I also noticed the shadow looks far too sharp. This triangular shadow looks much sharper than you would expect for a physical object sitting at that location. But this is the actual killer evidence. There's no way you would expect to get that for a natural variation of brightness in a picture. This was a still from a video where somebody said, I was photographing out of the window of the airliner and I noticed this UFO fly past. Well, you can look at that and say, well, yeah, okay, that does appear to be down there floating above the clouds. But as soon as you realise that it bears a striking resemblance to something which is quite definitely not a UFO, a computer-generated image from a particular video game whose name I can't mention for copyright reasons, it's fairly obvious that no, somebody has simply taken a computer-generated image and basically slapped it into a few frames of video to give the impression that they were looking at a fast-moving object passing the aircraft. Of course, computer-generated imagery is very good these days. Artificial intelligence will generate for you a picture of a UFO, which is quite convincing. It's getting more and more difficult to tell the difference between a genuine image and one that has been faked. So actually telling whether or not you're looking at an extraterrestrial spacecraft or whether you're looking at simply somebody's imagination, difficult to tell. I mean, let's face it, back in the 1990s, Jurassic Park showed us dinosaurs on the big screen. They were very convincing, even though we sort of knew they weren't actually real. But the fifth category of UFOs, we have to acknowledge the fact that if it's not one of the previous four, man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts or fakes, perhaps a UFO could be an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Somebody's done the hard work for us. They've categorized a whole load of UFO sightings. You perhaps can't read it here. These are 80 UFO models based on actual sightings. So people have reported seeing UFOs and then somebody has sat down and tried to classify them all. I really don't understand the classification. I can't tell really what the difference between an A5 UFO and an A6 UFO is. But somebody has done that. I'm interested not only to realise there are at least 80 of them, but notice this is UFO sightings set 1, implying maybe there's a set 2 somewhere. Maybe there's 160 different types of UFO flying around and we haven't necessarily identified them all. But NASA have, after a long investigation, finally reported on UFOs. They now call them Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, UAPs. It was interesting to read the NASA report because one of the things they said is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Absolutely right, as I said right at the start of this talk. They also made the point that when looking at UFO images and videos, if they occurred in the pre-digital era, we do not have the metadata. The metadata, the who took it, where, when, with what camera, with what lens, which way were they pointing, how high in the sky, what was the exposure, what was the F number. The metadata are often absent. With film cameras, they are nearly always absent, making a thorough understanding of the context difficult. I would argue the context is impossible if you don't actually know the details of how the picture was taken. Their conclusion: there is no conclusive evidence suggesting an extraterrestrial origin for unidentified anomalous phenomena. NASA buried millions of dollars into their investigation and they produced this report a few months ago. If they'd come to me directly, I could have told them all of that and they could have saved $100 million right from the off. But there you go. But there is a question. The lack of evidence for extraterrestrial UFOs does lead to the question that we can all ask ourselves. If we think of the number of stars in the Milky Way, it's something of order 300 billion stars in the Milky Way. Until fairly recently, we didn't know much about planets that are out there. We just knew that there were lots of stars. But now we know that most stars do have planetary systems. That's something we've learned in the last 10 or 20 years. So in fact, there are something like 150 billion planetary systems out there. And again, until fairly recently, we didn't know how many of those planetary systems may contain a planet similar to the Earth. But now we've got a pretty good handle on that. We think something like 1 in 3 of these planetary systems have planets that are Earth-like. So that's 50 billion planets that are Earth-like in our galaxy alone, let alone all the other galaxies in the universe. The big thing we really don't know is the likelihood of life springing up on these planets. Some people say if you've got the right conditions, life is inevitable. Other people say no, life is rare. And we really don't know the answer. If we simply assume that 99% of the time life doesn't spring up on Earth-like planets, then we have to divide that number by 100. What about life developing into complex life, more than just single-celled amoeba? Again, we have no idea. If we assume that even if life takes hold, 99% of the time it doesn't develop into multi-celled complex life, let's divide that number by 100 again. What about complex life developing some sort of intelligence? Even less idea whether that's likely to happen. Let's assume that 99% of the time complex life does not develop into intelligent life. Divide by 100 one more time. So that leaves us with a guess, an estimate, nothing more than that, of 50,000. 50,000 potential intelligent life planets out there. It might be that there aren't 50,000 out there because they simply don't last long enough. If civilizations last indefinitely, then there should be 50,000 civilizations knocking on our doorstep. And that's the so-called Fermi paradox. If they're out there, why haven't we heard from them yet? Is it simply that space is too big? Is it simply that visiting from one planet to another is too difficult? Is it because they don't want to communicate with us and they don't fancy sending any radio waves our way? Or is there some other reason? Remember this particular image taken from the Voyager spacecraft. There it is there, that single pixel in the image. Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. It's Earth. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The pale blue dot Carl Sagan, 1994. What I find unsettling is not the idea that we might have been visited by extraterrestrials. What I find unsettling is the idea that we might be alone. Thank you for listening.